we're good. Thank you. All right, let me just get this into slideshow format. All right, everybody can see this, we're good?
Yes.
All right, Carrie, take it away.
Thank you, Natalie. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carrie Watson. I'm an OBGYN physician. Somehow I'm Dr. Carrie Watson, MD, which is just funny and redundant. Maybe that's my own mistake. Let's go to the next slide.
That was mine, I apologize. I was adding it this morning.
That's all right. That's all right. So we want to pause and just acknowledge this is a heavy topic. And it really starts with 2 tragic deaths in 1995. Obviously, this is not the first time that strangulation occurred with domestic violence, but this is really a turning point in our understanding of both the medical and the psychosocial, even criminal significance of strangulation. These 2 women were unfortunately murdered by their partners. What was interesting about both of these situations is that they had been strangled before the homicide took place. So there was some time where law enforcement and others had a chance to potentially intervene. In both of these cases, you know, they happened, I want to say like a month or 2 apart. In both of these cases, you know, the victims themselves, as well as everybody else, medical systems, law enforcement, everybody really minimized what had happened to them and didn't intervene in time. And it was too late. So this happened in San Diego County, and their team down there, as you know, started the Family Justice Center movement, but they also did a lot of work really diving into understand strangulation after these really 2 tragic deaths. Because they happened kind of on their watch and they felt responsible to understand, you know, what this meant. The big question that they asked was, could strangulation be kind of a more significant injury than they had previously understood? Could it be kind of putting a relationship on a path to, you know, more abuse and assault, as well as to, you know, possibly homicide. So we've learned a lot from them. You can head to the next slide. I'm going to share a lot of the information that I've learned from them. And then, you know, I do want to just pause for a moment before we kind of dive into more of the details and say this, as I said, this is a heavy topic. I always like to pause before I present on this and remind us all that we're talking about something that's hard to talk about because we think by doing so and by learning, we can change how we all as a big system take care of each other and people who are experiencing this kind of abuse and potentially even help support people so that this abuse stops and does not continue to escalate. So although it's a heavy topic, I find it hopeful. And what helps me to kind of go through talking about something like this is to remember that important hope. So I like to just pause and invite all of us listening to remember something either related to our work in this heavy topic or even outside of our work that's really giving us hope. So I'll give you a moment of just quiet to think about that hopeful thing, and then we'll hold on to it while we listen to some hard topics. All right, perfect. So this is the website from the Strangulation Training Institute. This is where you can find all sorts of information. If you forget some of the things we talked about today, if you want to learn more, all of the statistics I have included, or almost all, are from here. And then I'm not going to show images today during the presentation. Sometimes those can be triggering or off-putting, but I have included them in an appendix. So if you're curious to see more, I have some images. They all come from this website as well. Let's go ahead to the next slide. So the first piece of information, medically speaking, is just to understand what strangulation is. You know, very often people who have experienced strangulation will say that they were choked. And actually strangulation and choking are 2 different things. Strangulation is what happens when there's pressure on the neck and that pressure causes obstruction in the flow of oxygen to the brain. It's actually not cutting off air supply. I think a lot of us think about that because often victims will say, like, I couldn't breathe. But it's really usually not the trachea, the windpipe, that's getting obstructed. What's getting obstructed is the two blood vessels on either side of the neck. And that limits the flow of oxygen up, also limits the flow of oxygen back down. And that's what causes all the problems. So we'll talk about that. What victims will often say, though, is, I was choked. And what choking actually is when food gets stuck in the windpipe and you need to do like the Heimlich maneuver or something like that. So they are two different things, but it's important to know that when patients say they were choked, they don't usually mean they were choking on food. They usually mean that someone had pressure on their neck. Something else I'd also like to remind us all about is that most of this preliminary research gained from the Strangulation Institute was really done on a cohort of female victims who were abused by a male partner. And so a lot of this initial evidence was really about how this is a gendered crime, or this only happens in certain types of relationships. I want to be really clear that we have learned that strangulation happens in all kinds of relationships, to all kinds of people across gender and sexuality spectrums. The other thing that's important to know is that strangulation can also happen in child abuse, can also happen in elder abuse. So it's not always in an intimate partner violence type relationship. Let's go to the next slide here. So strangulation is pressure, and it happens a few different ways. The most common is with hands, but it can also happen with other instruments, specifically using a ligature. That means like a belt or a rope. Those are pretty extreme situations. And then also by hanging, right? This is how people can be severely injured or die by having a rope around their neck, because it obstructs the blood vessels. And as I said, could be referred to as choking, strangling. Sometimes people will call it suffocation. Let's go to the next slide. And really the harm happens when it's obstructing first what we call the venous outflow, right? So we think about good blood with the oxygen is flowing away from the heart to the brain, and then, quote, bad blood or less oxygenated blood is going back to the heart. The venous outflow, or that less oxygenated blood, those blood vessels are the softest. So they're the first to get compressed when there's pressure. And when the deoxygenated blood can't come out of the brain, it sort of backs up, right? And then parts of the brain really can't get adequate oxygen. This can lead to loss of consciousness really quickly, even over the course of a few seconds or minutes. And once the muscles in the neck become relaxed with loss of consciousness, that pressure can further obstruct the carotid arteries. Those are the arteries taking blood up to the brain. They can also stimulate some of the nerve centers. These are called the carotid sinuses, right around those blood vessels. And that can cause what we call a reflex bradycardia or vasodilation. That's like fancy doctor speak, just to say that the heart rate will slow down. So again, like even less blood going up. And vasodilation means the blood vessels are trying to dilate to make anything move, right? Just to get that oxygen to keep flowing. So it's a big deal, because this is a big deal in any part of your body to not have oxygen, but obviously it's like a really big deal if it's not happening in your brain. So let's keep going. Really important to know, strangulation can be fatal. Loss of consciousness can happen really quickly. This totally depends on the amount of pressure and how long the pressure is sustained. But for a lot of pressure that's happening really quickly, loss of consciousness can happen in as little as 10 to 20 seconds. Permanent brain damage, when there's complete obstruction of both good blood and bad blood flowing up and down, that permanent brain damage can happen in just a few minutes, and death can happen in also just a few minutes. So this can happen very quickly. Let's go to the next slide. So this is where you see that sort of gendered data that we've had from the past. Unfortunately, that's still some of the best data that we've had. But it does say, about almost 90% of strangled women had a prior domestic violence history with their partner. What this means is that strangulation doesn't tend to start out early in the abuse, but it tends to mark escalation of abuse. Most people who have been strangled thought they would die when it happened. Really anything that makes us feel like we can't get oxygen is incredibly stressful. And you imagine like sort of being too deep in the water in the pool or getting knocked over by a big wave in the ocean. If you feel like you can't get to the surface and breathe, most of us start to really have a lot of anxiety about that. The same is true in these situations. Once the body feels like it doesn't have oxygen, it's very stressful and scary. Also, many of these people are being actively physically abused with additional injury above and beyond the actual strangulation, such as other head injuries, and even verbally threatened about being murdered. What they have found, in a lot of this research is that many of these perpetrators have a criminal history. As we've mentioned, strangulation can be fatal, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. So this I find to be one of the worst details in our statistics, is that many, many times children are watching when this is happening. So let's go to the next slide. Strangulation really increases the risk that a patient will be murdered. Really increases the risk both of attempted murder as well as a completed murder. And this is pretty dramatic. There are several things that we know from the danger assessment really increase the risk of homicide. Strangulation is like, being threatened with a weapon. It literally is being threatened with a weapon of hands. So let's go ahead to the next slide here. One of the really interesting things that still is a big deal for us now, although I think we've made some efforts to try to reduce this, but one of the really interesting things about this is that most of the time, this strangulation, which is this really profound and potentially very damaging, potentially lethal injury, often it doesn't leave a mark. So really, no matter what the pigment is of the skin, it can be very difficult to see any bruising at all or any sort of injury to the neck. And so for the longest time, this is why the medical community really discounted or misunderstood the significance of strangulation. There's sort of three groups of people here. That second group is a group that had injuries that were like so faint you couldn't photograph them, but they still had some visible injury. And then that bottom group was really teeny, like about 10% or less that have visible injuries. Really, the takeaway point here is that if a patient or a victim tells you that they've been strangled, they don't need proof, right? We don't need to demonstrate on their body that this happened to them. And we should believe people when they tell us this, no matter what their neck looks like. Let's go ahead to the next slide. I am hopeful that this statistic has changed since the studies were first done, because we've done a lot of work with our strangulation task force, with really trying to educate, all first responders and law enforcement, as well as folks in hospitals, to really help victims, seek attention. But at the time that the study was done, only 3% of victims really sought medical attention. And I think this is because, all of us, including law enforcement and the medical community and first responders, also victims and their families, really discounted the seriousness of this. Part of it is that victims may be kind of going in and out of consciousness, and they may have trouble remembering what happened. I've definitely had the experience talking with patients who are telling me about an assault and making a really big deal about being, sort of slapped on the face or are hit on the face, and kind of going to great extent to show me pictures about, how this happened. And then they kind of breeze over like, oh yeah, and then he choked me, and then this happened, and this happened. I'm like, time out, like, let's go back and talk about it. But I think that victims often minimize it because they didn't see an injury. And they may not be sure that it happened because they may have lost consciousness. So again, we really want to encourage people to seek medical attention, because you can't tell by looking, you can't tell by the victim's story how serious this was. So let's go ahead to the next slide. You know, from the medical perspective, some of the things we really look for to learn about how potentially dangerous this could be, medically speaking, we really want to ask about symptoms. And so we call that the history. So any pain in the throat, any voice changes, breathing changes or difficulty, trouble with pain or swallowing. Also, does the patient report a loss of consciousness? Again, the patient may not know, but we're doing our best to learn what we can. Any sort of seizure-like activity, you know, seizure-like activity can be really big and bold. It can be sort of like total body twitching, or it can be really minor, you know, and just one part of the body that is sort of repetitively moving. Sometimes seizure-like activity also looks like someone has gone unconscious, but they're breathing. So this can also be a little tricky. Again, we do the best we can. Ear pain, headaches, breathing rapidly, we call it hyperventilation, and then also loss of control of the bowel or the bladder, right? Any of these kinds of things suggest that this may have been a more significant episode of strangulation. Another thing that is important to note, just like, you know, people don't need visible proof, people don't need symptomatic proof to say that they were strangled, because many of these symptoms develop as the inflammation response happens. So if we see people immediately after strangulation, they may have none of these, because there hasn't been the chance for, you know, inflammation to develop, for bruising to develop, and you know, that's what takes up space and causes pain or difficulty with some of these normal body functions. Let's go to the next slide. As we said, often there's no visible injury. And you know, it can take time for these visible injuries to develop. You know, imagine when you like ram your leg into the door of your car by accident. Immediately it really hurts, but you may not see very much. And then the next day the bruise looks terrible. Same kind of thing here. It may take time for bruising to develop. Some of the things that you could see, but again, are not required. There may be cuts or finger-shaped imprints on the neck. You know, you may see 4 fingers, or the pinky doesn't really put a lot of pressure. So you may see 3 fingers. You may see some thumbprint bruising on the neck. Sometimes the bruising is underneath the jaw. Sometimes it's also behind the ears. You may also see what we call excoriations. These are scratch marks. And sometimes these are happening because the victim is trying to get the hands off. So they may even be self-inflicted, but they're really there in self-defense. As we said, often, sometimes these visible injuries are too subtle to document. You take a photo and it really doesn't show up. And then something else that's important to note, this is not only due to strangulation, but can show up with strangulation. These are called petechiae. These are little red dots that you can sometimes see in the eyes, like the white part of the eyes. Sometimes you'll see them on the face or the ears. For a non-living victim, you might see them on the internal organs at autopsy. And then the pharynx is the top of the mouth and the back of the throat. That's another place where they show up. Petechiae happen when little tiny blood vessels rupture. So it's just a teeny little amount of blood. And that happens due to pressure. So that's why strangulation can cause this. Other things that can cause this would be like a severe coughing fit, really severe prolonged vomiting. So strangulation is not the only thing, but it definitely can happen in these situations. Let's go to the next slide. There's some other serious risks, kind of, you know, as strangulation gets worse and sort of becomes more likely to be fatal. Carotid dissection is an important one and can happen. You know, our best estimates are 1 to 2% of people who've been strangled may have a carotid dissection. The carotid artery is the blood vessel that takes oxygenated blood to the brain, and this is in the neck, one on each side. When the artery dissects, that means that it develops a tear along the artery. This is dangerous because it means, first of all, the artery may not have the right pressure to sort of get the blood where it needs to go. And then also if that tear really continues to develop through all the layers of that blood vessel, you can start to have bleeding into the neck, and that can can result in less oxygen to the brain, which could lead to stroke, traumatic brain injury, and definitely could be fatal. So all of these are possible. And, from a medical perspective, 1% to 2% risk is low, but these are really serious complications. And so these are the kinds of things we want to look for, even in patients who may have no visible injury, right? Because the visible injury doesn't tell us anything about the severity of the assault. We really have to look on the inside. Next slide, please. So we're starting to have more research about strangulation. In this particular study, looking at about 400 patients, the adverse outcome rate was about 5%. So this includes, that carotid artery dissection I was mentioning. It also includes some fracture of the hyoid bone. The hyoid bone is a bone that goes kind of across here in the neck. Severe edema is basically like severe swelling that would make it hard for patients to breathe. A couple people had herniated discs. That's in the back of the neck where the spine is. And then the others were like a big variety of bad outcomes. One was miscarriage, some symptoms of a stroke. Some people had some enlargement of the lymph nodes. Pleural effusion means there started to be some fluid in the lungs, as well as some broken bones in the vertebrae. So again, that's spine, and then other kind of related issues to the carotid artery. Let's go to the next slide. This is put out by the Training Institute for Strangulation Prevention. I find this to be a really helpful kind of guide for the medical community to really think through when patients may need additional imaging to look inside the neck or the brain. And that really kind of is based on symptoms here as well as the physical exam. So no need to kind of memorize any of this. But this is what we use in my institution. This is how we kind of make decisions about who needs imaging and who needs further evaluation. Let's go ahead. Yeah, so many experts really recommend observation for 12 to 24 hours, particularly when you have these more severe symptoms or signs. So any report about loss of consciousness is probably smart to watch patients longer. Any of those kind of petechiae, those red spots in the face, which suggest more prolonged injury to the vessels. Any soft tissue injury in the neck, and then also incontinence of the bladder or the intestines. And then if the patient is intoxicated, then it's always really hard to gauge how much information we have that's accurate, either from the history that the patient is telling us or also in our exam. And that leads to a little bit more concern about being able to follow up if things progress at home. So these are some situations. Again, this is not a hard and fast rule, but these are some spaces when we recommend additional evaluation. So here's an example. This is a young woman who came in with some neck bruising and pain. Initially, she didn't acknowledge any sort of partner violence or strangulation. On exam, there was bruising of the neck. So she was one of those rare people who actually did have some physical exam findings. She also had some tenderness on movement of the neck, or even just as we call it palpating, but touching the neck. The physician happened to be one of our family violence advocates and was concerned about strangulation. And so she recommended a further evaluation. So this patient was initially seen in a sort of urgent care setting and was transferred to the emergency room, where she acknowledged the assault, and our team was able to confirm that the police were already involved. She did have imaging that showed that she'd had a left carotid dissection. The treatment sounds really simple, but it can be life-saving. Actually, in this situation, we want to help limit the risk of a blood clot, which is what can happen when there's so much pressure in the brain, and we can do that by starting aspirin. This patient did not want additional follow-up, but she was able to get the medical treatment that she needed. Next slide, please. This is a CT image. So CT is sort of like cool video x-ray of the body. And this actually shows, kind of where the two arrows are is where you would expect to see the carotid arteries, and they get way too thin on those two sides there. This is a really young victim who came in after strangulation and actually had bilateral carotid artery dissections. So this person was at very high risk for stroke, if not death, even a few days afterwards. So thankfully she was able to come in and get care. Next slide, please. Yeah, so let me pause here. This is really the end of the formal conversation. What kinds of questions can I answer for all of you?
And feel free to come off mute if you want, or type in the chat as well.
I see a hand up.
Oh, Yenny, go ahead. Do you want to unmute yourself? Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Yenny from the Latina Center. Buenos dias a todos. I have a question because sometimes I've heard victims say like he was choking me, but he wasn't really choking me. So like I'm always like wondering like when does it become a choke? Like is it just me holding my neck, or like is it force? Because sometimes they tell me like, oh, he wasn't really hurting me, but it's like, okay, but his hands were on your neck. So is that considered trying to strangle someone, or is that not as, yeah, what's the line between what's serious and what isn't? If there is
I mean, such a good question. I think that's what makes our job difficult, right? Is asking that, because on the one hand, it's true. Like I'm putting my hands on my neck right now. I'm not causing any pressure or injury. I think a lot of it would have to do with some further conversation with that client or patient to understand, was this in the context of an assault? Then I would be suspicious that the pressure would have been enough to cause an injury. Or was it in the context of an argument? It may not have been enough to cause an injury in that situation, but it could definitely play into that power and control dynamic. And may not be physical abuse, but could be, threats of violence, threats of harm. So I would suggest, further conversation there about the amount of pressure and the context. Some of the rest of you who've had these conversations may also have ideas about how to sort of suss that out.
I think it's just important to note, just to add on, that doesn't take very much pressure to block those arteries, right? It's just how do they describe it in one of the other trainings? It's like if you open a soda can, right? That's the amount of pressure that you need just to start blocking it. So it's not so much about the intense pressure that you would expect, but it's just even a little bit of pressure can be enough to cause these symptoms, right? Or enough to threaten their life. I also think it's important, and we'll get into this later as well. I think it's also important to note, again, that power and control and how your life is literally in their hands just by having their hand around your throat, right? Because they could kill you within a few minutes, as we learned, right? So I think it's not just about the pressure, but it's also about the threat, and that, yes, I only have to do a little bit of pressure to be able to have your life in my hands ultimately.
And in terms of law enforcement, we also err on the side of caution, if you will. So if somebody has told us, hey, he strangled me, but I was able to breathe or was able to move and somewhat try to protect myself, we're still going to encourage them to seek medical attention. And we urge them to go to the hospital to make sure that their health is the utmost importance.
If I could also add, I think being in that state of mind, it's also the whole thing of like, well, I wasn't unconscious, that I think a person will always say like, well, he was choking me, but not choking me because I was still breathing or I wasn't fully out. So I definitely think that also it's more of an individual state of mind at that moment, that they feel that they weren't being choked because they didn't feel the pressure was strong enough. But a lot of times it was strangulation. It was just that the person can't admit it or see it at that moment because they feel like they were still conscious at that point.
Yeah, excellent point, Karina. And loss of consciousness is not required to cause a physical injury.
Thanks, Yenny. That was a great question. Other questions people have for Dr. Watson?
Dr. Watson, if I can chime in and ask a question. I'm Adam Wilkes, DA's office, and one of the things that I'm very glad that you touched on was the absence of exterior injury or external injury in the cases of strangulation to loss of consciousness or even to death. For people doing my work, we have seen a big change in the kinds of results that we're able to obtain at trial or in presenting evidence in strangulation cases where we use MRI or CT imaging. I'd like to know, have you seen any changes within the medical field in how often patients who report strangulation, whether to loss of consciousness or sort of whatever the specific symptomology that they describe, how often is it that treating physicians are referring patients to have either MRI or CT? If that question makes sense?
It does make sense. It sounds like you're wondering if we are imaging more,
Yes,
perhaps
thank
than
you.
we used to. Yeah, so anecdotally, I would say I think that we are. This is really hard to track. So I've been doing some work to try to figure out how we can adjust our coding so that we can figure out how often these patients are coming in and then track who's getting imaged and who's not and why, and do some quality work there. But I will say I believe more people are being imaged because we've made a big effort to educate about the risks of strangulation and give people the tools about when to image and how to make that decision.
Outstanding, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Any other questions for Dr. Watson? All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Watson. I think that was a very clear overview of the medical risks of strangulation. It doesn't take very much, a significant amount of time to have very severe consequences. So that's something that we really try and relate to the clients at the Family Justice Center. And I know Stan also does that as well. So really appreciate your insight and time and expertise on this issue.
Of course, thank you for having me. I do need to take off, but if you guys come up with other questions, please filter them to Natalie. Happy to keep answering and support you guys.
Thanks.
Really proud of all the work that you guys do.
Thank you.
All
right. And our next presenters are going to be Adam Wilkes from the DA's office and Sergeant Chris Tong from Richmond PD. And Adam, do you want to try sharing your screen?
I'll give it a try right now. So thank you. Let me see if I can. I have somehow made it through this whole pandemic, and this is the first time that I've ever been asked to give a presentation in which I shared my screen. So just one moment. All right. Can everyone, let's see.
Yep, we can see it.
All right. Okay. I'll do the introduction. Sorry, Chris. Again, my name's Adam Wilkes. I'm a deputy district attorney for Contra Costa County. I have been assigned to the domestic violence unit after 3 years in sexual assault since March of this year, working at the Family Justice Center in Richmond, where I work with detectives who are specially assigned to special unit cases with the Richmond Police Department.
And good morning, everybody. My name is Chris Tong. I am a sergeant with the Richmond Police Department. I currently am in charge of the Domestic and Sexual Violence Unit at the Family Justice Center. I've been with the department for 15 years. My career path has been as a patrol officer. Then I moved into the Domestic and Sexual Violence Unit as a detective. I was then promoted and then returned back to the Domestic and Sexual Violence Unit as a supervisor. Currently, I manage 5 detectives, and we handle cases anywhere from domestic violence, sexual assault, human trafficking, child abuse, both physical and sexual, elder abuse, and missing persons. It's a heavy caseload for my detectives, but they all work diligently and very thoroughly on all the cases that they receive.
And so by way of introduction, our purpose today is to give our partners and the people here sort of an overview of what we face in investigating these cases and potentially prosecuting them. So that way you're a little bit more informed about the way that these things, or the way that the issues related to strangulation might come up for law enforcement and for prosecutors. So I'll let Chris start off in terms of how these cases initially are presented to law enforcement.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and first off, my apologies if I sound a bit congested. I think I'm coming off a bit of a cold. I know it to be a cold because I got tested. I was negative, thank goodness. So if I sound a bit off or hard of understanding, please just let me know. When I was asked to do this presentation, I was actually really glad to. Strangulation has been a big misconception in terms of law enforcement, prosecution, the court process, et cetera, for survivors of domestic violence, specifically strangulation. And it was always my one of my goals to make sure it's more well known throughout society and through the court process to hopefully get the attention that it deserves. As the doctor had mentioned, strangulation is very serious. It could be a one-time incident that could impact a person's life where it results in death. And I don't think society, the court system, specifically going through to trial and beyond, really understands the lethality of strangulation. We here in Contra Costa County have started a strangulation task force, and we're hoping to educate the process a bit to include defense attorneys, judges, et cetera, in hopes to get these scans more frequent in the medical field and establish a protocol much like we have for sexual assault survivors. And so, yes, it is a work in progress, but we're doing all that we can to make sure it gets the attention it deserves. So I wanted to begin in terms of law enforcement perspective to kind of share what it's like for a law enforcement personnel when from the beginning of a call all the way through to presenting that particular case to the district attorney. You might say, hey, this could be a generic timeline, if you would, but it's going to give you a good picture of law enforcement's perspective. So we'll talk about the initial 911 call, police response to a scene or to an incident, what evidence collection may be, if there will be an arrest or not, what a detective would do and the follow-up required, and then presenting that particular case to the deputy district attorney for review. Next slide. So I found this quote online. It's from a book Plato wrote, Phaedrus. Things are not always what they seem. The first appearance, gosh, I can't read that. Detects many. The intelligence of a perception is what has maybe carefully been hidden. And so when a caller calls in to 911 or to a dispatcher, they then talk about what they first experienced. And so it could be the survivor themselves. It could be a witness. It could be a child who observed what had gone on. It could be a neighbor who had not seen anything but just heard what took place. And so an officer gets as much information as possible in terms of what he or she is going to walk into and then responds to the scene. One important thing that our officers in Richmond are trained is to ask, if it's not given, what information they have in terms of the parties who reside in that residence, as well as has there been previous calls for service to that residence. It'll give that officer or officers the understanding of what they're going to walk into. So they arrive on. Did you have anything, Adam?
Oh, no.
Okay, so officers arrive on scene, and the most important things that need to occur is gaining the survivor's trust, keeping people safe, gathering facts, collecting evidence, and determining who to arrest, if any. And I put gain the survivor's trust first and foremost, because that's going to be a key piece of a patrol officer's response when they arrive on scene. Um, Obviously, we're there to keep people safe, and so we're going to separate the parties involved. We're going to make sure that the survivors away from the abuser, in a different room, perhaps, or out of sight, so that that person can't influence the survivor and what he or she is going to say to us. That's very important. As we talked briefly moments ago about the power and control of a abuser, it can take as little as a look from that person to have a survivor all of a sudden be willing to cooperate with police to no longer be willing to. So it's important for us to take that individual away from the situation, let them know that we're there to help and that we have resources on our side to make sure that they're safe and away from the situation for the rest of their life if they so choose. And so we do that, but we also gather facts. So once a person is away from the abuser, an officer is going to sit down, and I mean sit down and not talk over them, and try to understand what took place. A survivor of domestic violence is really caught up in the situation. The adrenaline may be running. Maybe he or she is thinking, gosh, I love this person. I want things to work out. And are only going to give the officer small pieces of the truth because they don't want to affect their situation. And so that trust element is going to be huge for the officer. We spent a lot of time at Richmond training the officers in response to domestic violence. One, because it's a very serious crime, but also it's one of those crimes that often are overlooked in terms of it could result in homicide. And so officers look for cues that maybe the survivor isn't entirely forthcoming, looking for things through observation on the survivor, whether it be their face, their neck, their hands, etc., and trying to determine, one, is there any physical injuries that would be good evidence, but also talking points, perhaps, where an officer could ask questions to that survivor. Hey, what happened to your neck? Or what are those spots that you see on your eye? And able to gain more information about what occurred and hopefully gain additional trust of that person. A arrest will take place if there's enough evidence and enough information to deem so. And we'll talk further in terms of the next steps on the slides to follow. Evidence collection for a domestic violence incident can be challenging. We often deal with cases where it involves the survivor and the abuser, and that is it. We sometimes we'll receive calls from neighbors who hear things but don't see things. And it's difficult to prove a case to the district attorney as well as to a jury that this survivor's story is true and holds true over the abuser's story. It's very frustrating at times, and we are forced to make sure we look through a scene, we look through a survivor, we look through an abuser to try to find as much evidence as possible to hold the abuser accountable. So it's not only a disarray residence or a disheveled living room, broken glass perhaps, but it's beyond that. It's looking at that particular survivor and identifying those small injuries that may not even be noticeable, and trying to hone in on those. We talk a bit about petechiae, and those are, as we mentioned, blood vessels that had ruptured, leaving spots on a person's body, and they could be on the face, it could be on the eye, it could be on the neck, it could be on the arm, and it's places that you need to look closely, or an officer needs to look closely to identify those. Um, those are easily captured on, or correction, not easily captured. They're captured on photographs, and so an officer would photograph those injuries and document them accordingly. Um, the strangulation cases that we have had leave, the ones that I have observed have been only a small handful where there's actually injuries on a person's neck. And it's quite frustrating. We know based off of a person not being able to talk clearly, um, maybe um, the blood vessels have broken, but on the eye or around the face, and not being able to show the damage around the neck is definitely disheartening. Um, what we do is we'll follow up with that survivor a day, 2 days, 3 days later, and oftentimes we find injuries that are more pronounced. And that's just through the healing process. Sometimes we're able to capture injuries that weren't clearly visible initially, but later are. Next slide. So once a survivor is interviewed, once we've documented the injuries that we see, once we photograph those, once we photograph the scene, we even ask the abuser what had happened to try to understand his side of the story. We make arrests if at all possible, and just because we believe something happened, we need more than that to make that arrest. We need probable cause, and this is a generic definition of it, but I just want everyone to understand it's a probable cause to arrest exists when the totality of circumstances, so everything that officer has gathered for this particular case, would cause a person of ordinary care and prudence, so somebody who's not in law enforcement, somebody who's not a judge or an attorney, to entertain an honest and strong suspicion that the person be arrested is guilty of the crime. So looking at all of that information, could a reasonable person, an average person, believe, hey, that person really did this crime? Then we're able to make that arrest. So we let's assume that we make an arrest, the abuser is gone, and now an officer is with a survivor by him or herself. Next slide. One piece that I'm glad our department has taken very seriously is ensuring the safety of the survivor and any children who may be in the home, or any other people in the home for that matter. A officer with our department, and many in Contra Costa County, are following the lethality assessment program that you see in front of you. It is a questionnaire that we ask survivors, and it is very important for us to understand full circle, or as much of full circle as possible, in terms of the abuse that he or she has been put through. This protocol, or this program, is important to us because we're able to determine if somebody is quote unquote high risk. And there's no definitive way of knowing, hey, is this person high risk of potential homicide? There's no certain way of determining that, but this is as close as possible as we could come. We answer questions, or the survivor answers questions that the officer asks, and depending on a yes or no response will trigger whether a survivor is at high risk. And as a result, we're able to enact certain protocols to ensure the safety of those individuals. We work very closely with STAND, an advocacy group for domestic violence, to ensure that we're able to put the survivor and or children in a safe place, away in case the abuser gets out of custody. We're able to provide them and reassure them that, hey, okay, you may be dependent on this person financially, but we could work with you to put you in certain programs to make sure that you can do this on your own. You don't need that individual anymore. And it's the partnership that the police department and STAN has, and how serious our officers take domestic violence and strangulation, that makes this truly work. Next slide. So the officer completes that lethality assessment protocol form, ensures the safety of the survivor, and ensures and offers and encourages care, medical care of the survivor. It's something we cannot force, but we always tell them, based upon this card that we have, that it is important because you've been a victim of domestic violence and that you've been strangled, and potentially there could be potential dangers or health concerns based on the strangulation. It is truly up to the survivor if they're going to go to the hospital or not, but we do encourage it. One case in particular that I had, and there's been a small handful that I hold dear to my heart, was a woman. She was in her 40s and she had been strangled. She was brought to the police department and was waiting for detectives. I went in to go introduce myself, and I looked at her, 2 black eyes and marks around her neck, and with water in her eyes. I don't get choked up often, but I did, and I said, "Oh my gosh, what had happened?" And she starts to speak to me, and she is very hoarse. And I'm not the judgmental type. I asked, "Hey, is that your normal voice?" And she said, "No, it's not." And so I told her, "Okay, no more talking. We'll talk later, but we need to get you to the hospital." And she shakes her head no. And I said, "I will figure out the money. I just need to make sure you're safe. And I want you to go." She knew I was very sincere, and I ended up driving her to the hospital. There she got the care she needed, and she's fine today. But it's concerns that survivors have. Maybe why they don't want to go to the hospital is because of the money, or maybe they don't want to go to the hospital because of other reasons. But it's dear to me, it's dear to many at our department to make sure that survivors and victims are safe, and that they can live long and healthy lives beyond the incident. And it's taking the time out at such as that to ensure people care, and the survivors need to know that, and that one particular one does for sure. Next slide. So after a detective re-interviews the survivor, after they look to see if there's potential additional evidence, such as video surveillance perhaps, or maybe setting up a recorded phone call if need be, with the abuser, The case is put together and a detective meets with the deputy district attorney for review. In majority of the case, it's with Adam, who will speak next. Mind you, Adam knows nothing about the case, so it's my detective's job to ensure Adam can paint a clear picture in his mind of what took place. So the detectives are taught to make sure you include all the information that you have, whether you feel it's not important or it is, and provide that to Adam or the deputy district attorney to be reviewed. And the deputy district attorney or prosecutor will review the case. And this is my understanding of if a deputy district attorney can hold the abuser accountable or not. I'm sure there's more factors to that. Adam will speak to it, and so I don't want to speak to this on Adam's behalf.
No, I think you've done an excellent job. So that's you've summarized it probably better than I could. And as a lawyer, I'm sure everyone appreciates that, because I could probably talk about it for far longer than the allotted time.
No, thank you. Thank you. That concludes my piece of the presentation. Adam will continue with the process, and we both agreed that it's probably a good time to open up for questions at this point, and then Adam could move forward going from there.
Yeah, and Adam, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can try and have you share, because it's in presenter mode right
Thank you
now.
so much. I'm so sorry. If I
That's okay.
realized that it was in presenter mode, again, bear with me. I apologize. Thank you, everyone.
Actually, that was very helpful for me, Adam, so thank you.
Okay, good. All right, I will stop that.
Does anyone have questions for Sergeant Tong?
Hi, yes. So my name is Alicia Elliott. And Sergeant Tong, it sounds like you have a heart, that you reach out to the community, helping the community, going the extra mile to ask questions. And I've thought about women who are afraid to call the police because they may be a fear of losing their children. For communities of color, particularly Black and brown, or Black men and Black women, may be afraid to reach out because of the history and experience that they've had with law enforcement. How are you all? I know at the beginning of your presentation, you said that the police, they must gain the trust of that person. And so for those communities of color, how are you able to do that? Or how is the Richmond Police Department doing that, reaching out to those communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Sylvia. But pre-COVID, gosh, COVID really messed up a lot of things for us, hadn't it? But pre-COVID, I had asked our stat person to look at calls for service in terms of where domestic violence incidents occurred most frequently. Mind you, okay, that's probably not the best way to look at things, but I'm trying to narrow it down in terms of communities or groups so that I could target a certain group or help a certain group. And so we being the Family Justice Center, STAND, the police department has responded to those communities and spoke in regards to domestic violence. One, that a person who calls the police can remain anonymous. It does not need to be, hey, my name's Chris Tong. This is my number. This is my address. Yes, I'm going to go to court. It doesn't need to be all that. It could be anonymous. Hey, I hear somebody getting beat up next door. You need to send the police. And then it's up to our officers to determine or to figure out what took place. I don't like to toot our own horn, but we do a good job to really build that trust, to really display active listening skills and interpersonal skills, and talking to people who have fell victim to domestic violence in an effort to really help them. we also display at these presentations the services that are available. And I think that's a big piece of it from my experience, that a survivor, yes, there's love there or care there, whatever the case may be. A lot of times it becomes, I am dependent upon this individual. Yes, I get beat up. Yes, I'm put down all the time, but I need that person to survive and to live. And it's our job as police officers to really let them know, hey, no, you don't. There is a lot more out there, a lot of programs out there that we could link you up with so that you can get the help you need. So you don't need to rely on this person. And yes, it's a work in progress, but it's something that we continue to move forward with.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Alicia, for that question. Sylvia, you have your hand up.
This is a question for Sergeant Tong. Are there any resources in terms of like self-defense for, a potential encounter on a strangulation situation?
Yeah, it's a great question. And sorry, Alicia, I called you Sylvia, and I saw that because it popped up on my screen. So my apologies. Sylvia, no, there's none that I'm fully aware of. That is a great idea though. And so I'm going to bring that back to my department. Perhaps we could put something together in our Citizens Academy that we host, or perhaps something totally separate of that, just for self-defense moves or techniques to help people, whether it be domestic violence incidents, whether it be safety incidents on the street. But that's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sylvia. Any other questions for Sergeant Tong?
Yes, I had a question for him.
Yes, Lorena.
Yes, I work with a family that the mother was victim of domestic violence. She was afraid to call the police due to her immigration status, because she said if I call the police, they're gonna deport me and I'm gonna leave my kids in the United States. So I would like to know if any resource that I can provide to the families or the mothers who's a victim of domestic violence, that they not to be afraid. They had like no document papers, so due to her immigration status, they can even still call the police because they're afraid that also they call the police, they're gonna deport me.
Yeah.
So there's any resources?
Yeah, and what group do you work with?
For me,
What group do you work with, or who do you work with?
I work for West Contra Costa YSB.
Okay. Yeah. My contact information is going to pop up on the next slide or at the end. Feel free to get a hold of me, and I could arrange for a presentation if you have a group meetings or if you want me to reach out to that person in particular. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Okay.
We've recently partnered with the Latina Center, where one of my detectives responds and spoke to their group to let individuals know, hey, any crime that takes place, irregardless of your status or who you are, you should call the police.
Okay.
One, we're not going to deport anybody who is victim of a crime for any reason at all. And that information is irrelevant. Sadly, though, we are also a sanctuary city where we're not going to deport somebody who is an abuser either. Mind you, once they leave Richmond and they go somewhere else, that's potentially entirely different. But a survivor of a crime, interpersonal violence or not, will not be deported. The kids will not be deported. And they should be encouraged to contact the police.
Okay.
And Chris, is it correct in saying that your officers don't even ask?
We do not.
What
Yeah,
the status?
thank Natalie. We do not. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And now I'm going to say something that I'm sure. Well, I'm going to say something. There are certain crimes also that qualify for an undocumented individual to obtain a U visa. And it's to obtain citizenship in our city through a U visa. And domestic violence does qualify for that. Mind you, it shouldn't be the reason why a survivor calls the police. But if they are being abused, they need to call. One, so we could get them out of that situation, but two, potentially help them through their status in the country.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
All right, we're gonna go ahead and move on to Adam's portion of the presentation, just so that we stay on time. But Adam, take it away, and the screen looks perfect.
Okay, thank you, and apologies. Thanks for everyone bearing with me. All right. So I'll start off by saying that the level of response and the attention that we give to victims of these crimes, and specifically to victims of strangulation, it is that seriousness that, in my view, transforms victims to survivors. And when victims see the level of attention and care that people in the community give to them in dealing with these crimes and dealing with trauma after the fact, speaking for myself and just being an expert in nothing except my own story, I can say that it is that level of response that changes a lot about outcomes in terms of whether or not a victim is cooperative with prosecution, whether or not a victim of these crimes accepts that, either looks at these crimes as an inevitable part of life or as something that the victim does not have to deal with and should not have to deal with. I've been fortunate that in my career, I've been able to tell stories of victims of violent crime, and dealing with accounts and the stories of women who have been strangled and really dealt with near lethal violence has been really personal to me. So I'm really grateful to get to do this work. So in terms of what actually happens when I do my job, understand that I come in as a deputy district attorney later on in the process, after detectives and investigators like police officers on the scene have already done their job. Prosecutors really have a very limited window of authority, and that is to use the authority of the court system to prosecute a crime. That is a pretty limited slice of the total number of crimes that occur in Contra Costa County. And the tools that I have to prosecute these crimes and to obtain specific results, those things are limited as well. But most important thing to know is that I am a prosecutor who brings charges based upon the rules and the laws that are written down. So the examples that I've written here, think things like robbery, car theft, tax fraud, murder. All of those things have specific legal definitions. I'll begin by one that, with reference to one that I think is particularly applicable in the area of strangulation, that being attempted murder. In my view, a plurality, a portion of the survivors who I talk to who have survived a strangling, an event of strangulation, they are victims of an attempted murder. And I'll talk about why. Now, if you were to go to the sort of pull up the law books at issue, here's what I would need to prove to a jury in order to prove that someone is guilty of attempted murder. I would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt two things. I'd have to prove that the defendant took a direct but ineffective step towards killing a person, and that they had the intent to kill. It is required that I show that that person had a definite and unambiguous intent to kill someone. So when we talk about attempted murder, there's always going to be a tension between what happened and the evidence that I have that supports what happened or proves what happened. It comes in two forms, that being direct and circumstantial evidence. No need to kind of do a careful reading of the slides here, but direct evidence, you could think of it as someone directly seeing something or somebody actually describing what happened. Direct evidence would be a woman coming into court and describing, I was strangled. This man's hands were around my neck. Circumstantial evidence would be, for example, DNA evidence or marks that may be left behind. Those things form circumstantial evidence. And one of the important parts of circumstantial evidence is intent, because an intent to kill has to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. But it is always established with, or sorry, in most cases is established with circumstantial evidence. And the reason for that is because we very rarely have a direct window into what someone is thinking. So when I talked about the difference between what happened and what a prosecutor is able to prove, understand that there is going to be a gap and a difference between those things. Because even in cases where I, as a prosecutor and someone who is experienced in dealing with these crimes, can say, boy, it seems as though this person very likely intended to kill this victim, the typical body of evidence that I have may leave room for doubt. There may be some question about what the defendant's or the suspect's intention was. That's especially true if after the fact, after a defendant strangled someone, afterwards, if there's an argument, if the defendant leaves the scene while the victim is conscious. Those things, in many cases, will prevent a prosecutor from filing an attempted murder charge. Now, let's talk about then, well, what typically makes up a body of evidence in a provable case? Well, that could be a 911 call, or sometimes it's a victim who goes to the hospital and speaks to a mandatory reporter. Oftentimes, police officers who respond on scene. And the critical evidence that I've encountered, and a big sea change within the last 10 years in law enforcement, are the contemporaneous statements of a victim while on scene, meaning while someone is still dealing with the stress of an event, if the incident is captured on body cam as the victim initially relays it. Also, in a provable case, I'll either have the testimony of a victim or of someone on scene, a third party who may have seen or heard something significant. And then in some cases, medical evidence. Now, there's additional evidence that I have because in many cases of strangulation, we are dealing with crimes that are related to what's called intimate partner violence, meaning there is a connection and relationship between a victim and their assailant. So as distinguished from crimes between two people who don't know each other, as per like a robbery or something, or like a crime where somebody's car is stolen. Here, we have crimes where there is a regular pattern and habit of communication as between a suspect and a victim. So additional pieces of evidence may come up, those being jail calls. If somebody's taken into custody, the calls that that person makes from in custody could be reported or they're recorded, and then we're able to obtain those later on. Text messages between a victim and her assailant, and recordings of conversations that may have happened between those two.
Okay, two black eyes, my hit here on my left ear.
I play that section there, and I don't know if everybody could hear it, but that is a piece of evidence that I used in a closing argument once. It was a recording of a jail call between a victim who was not present at the trial and her assailant. In the same jail call, she also described feeling sick, feeling that her tongue was swollen, and she couldn't talk for 2 days after. The way that she sounds in that jail call was not her normal speaking voice because she had been strangled. But afterwards, after the fact, in this first jail call, that was her just trying to get her assailant, her boyfriend, to understand what he had actually done to her. So that brings up a significant limit of these kinds of cases and the kinds of evidence that I'll have. And I'll start with question one, and the other two, I think we'll just kind of, I'll walk us through, but where do these crimes often take place? Can anyone help me out? If anyone can offer an answer.
And Nicole wrote in the chat, home. Jacqueline also said home.
Absolutely.
Home is a very popular answer.
Yeah. So private places with few witnesses. It is very often that cases that we prosecute, and this is true across the board, the most significant cases that prosecutors bring in court are those in which the only witnesses are the person who was the victim of the crime and their assailant. I asked other questions that I believe we've already had very salient answers to, that being, well, what's the victim able to describe about what happened? Of course, there's going to be limits to those things. I've analogized to juries in closing that, you know, if you had a case about a car crash, one of the worst witnesses for, well, what happened during the crash will probably be the person who's inside the car. Victims are going to struggle to describe how long an event took place for. Sometimes the questioning posed on cross-examination by a defense attorney, well, which hand did he use? How many times did he change hands? For how long was he using both hands as opposed to one? Right? It would be impossible for, even for a prize fighter, to identify how many times they were struck in the course of like an MMA fight. It's equally impossible for a victim of crime of strangulation to describe those kinds of minute details. And as we also heard in terms of medical evidence, not only do we have the absence of evidence, because in a majority or a strong number of these cases, we'll have absolutely no exterior mark whatsoever, but we will also have contradictory evidence. And so when I talk about contradictory evidence, I mean evidence that could be interpreted as either self-defense or evidence that, for example, the assailant has marks on him, or, you know, and I'm using gendered language, but that's just related to sort of the work that I do. The assailant very often will have scratch marks consistent with two people being in close physical proximity. It could well happen that a victim of strangulation has no marks on them whatsoever, and yet the assailant has scratch marks or bite marks. And distinguishing between those things and understanding that the presence or absence of an injury doesn't alone determine what actually happened. And that's where there's something unique that happens in strangulation cases, and that's the addition of expert testimony. In my view, expert testimony is important in strangulation cases for prosecutors to counter the expectations that our jurors have. A lot of times the impressions that people form of what violent crime looks like, those are not formed by real life. They are formed by the things that people see on television. And on television, a victim of strangulation may have makeup after the fact to make a bruise look really present or pronounced, because it makes it more dramatic. You know, people have sort of the CSI effect, the belief that there's going to be DNA evidence or a particular type of DNA shedding that's going to be particularly probative. And that doesn't match up with real life. So if I'm presenting a case like this, what I would look for from an expert, or what I might bring in front of a jury, is to get jurors to understand the seriousness of these crimes. That being that strangulation to unconsciousness is possible within 5 to 10 seconds. And that if a victim is present in court and describes being strangled to unconsciousness, suppose she has no marks whatsoever on her, on the area of her neck, on her body at all. That's entirely possible. And I've had jurors sort of gasp at the reaction of, it is possible to strangle someone to death within 4 minutes and leave no exterior mark whatsoever. Strangulation to unconsciousness possible with nothing more than the force of a firm handshake. And we also had a discussion earlier. Specific marks and specific kinds of injuries, they may be hard for jurors to understand what they mean. Scratch marks, right? If somebody was strangled, why is it that a victim has these sort of downward raking marks on their neck? Why is it that you have a scratch that runs from here to here? Well, crescent-shaped marks on a victim's neck are entirely consistent with somebody trying to pull an assailant off of them. And an expert on strangulation can also describe that, yes, when an assailant comes in after, during an investigation, and investigators find a large bite mark right here, that is particularly probative. It's probative of somebody probably fighting for their life in a near lethal case of strangulation. So I'd like to kind of shift gears there and talk about the laws that I use in doing my job. Apart from the evidence that we'll oftentimes have in court, well, how does the law come into play, and what are the laws that I use? So one of the most important things that I have, one of the most important tools that I have as a prosecutor is Evidence Code Section 1109. I bet nobody showed up today in the hopes that you would hear somebody recite a bunch of, you know, like legal terms and specific code sections. I'm not asking anybody to pay attention to that, but the idea is that I want everybody to understand what the law says and what the law will allow in these kinds of cases. Now, here's the actual text, and it doesn't read like plain English. In fact, it's sort of indecipherable. It says in a criminal action in which the defendant is accused of an offense involving domestic violence. I probably lost many of you. And in fact, if you look down here, there's even the double negative. Well, this evidence is not made inadmissible by section 1109 if the evidence is not inadmissible pursuant to evidence code section 352. I've been doing this for 11 years. I just lost myself. What everybody should understand in non-lawyer is that if I am presenting a domestic violence case, the fact that the suspect or the perpetrator, the defendant, has committed domestic violence in the past is allowed into evidence as long as it didn't take place too far in the past, think like 10 years, and the other acts that we're talking about are not so inflammatory that like the jury just couldn't be asked to hear about them. And that brings in a lot of the domestic violence cases that we have. So when I charge a case, there are, I'll say, there's going to be 3 or 4 different crimes that I use pretty often. One of them being false imprisonment, which is, it, you know, when I hear that term, that's the legal definition. It sounds kind of like, I always think of that word as like Rapunzel being locked in a tower. That's not actually what it is. When you think about false imprisonment, that's somebody being restrained or confined in a given area or in a given place when they don't want to be there. While that we might think about things like somebody being in a cell or in a locked room, what we're really talking about is somebody being kept on a bed or on a couch during an argument, someone being pushed down and strangled. And so somebody being restrained, like pushed up against a wall, that's false imprisonment. And somebody putting their hand on somebody's neck is false imprisonment through the use of force, violence, or menace. That's a felony. And that's one of the charges that I'll very often bring in these cases. Similarly, assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury is another crime. And I like to present these cases where I charge those things together because it gives the jury all of the different options or tools to look at all the different ways that somebody may have committed a crime, and to ensure that, suppose that the jury said, well, this person, they weren't really confined because the physical struggle took place around the apartment. Well, that may be true. So perhaps she wasn't specifically confined in one spot. However, the assailant absolutely committed assault with force likely to produce great bodily injury because there was a strangulation incident. So I charge those cases with the idea that a jury could wind up returning guilty verdicts, or I give the jury all the tools that they need to return a guilty verdict in the hopes of holding somebody accountable. There's also a specific enhancement for inflicting great bodily injury during a domestic violence incident. Many people I talk to are surprised to learn that domestic violence as a felony is considered a non-violent felony under the law of the state of California. So when people talk about the rules that govern early release, people getting favorable custody credits, felony domestic violence with a prior felony domestic violence conviction actually qualifies as a non-violent felony. However, if someone inflicts great bodily injury, like rendering a victim unconscious, or putting that person in a hospital, that could qualify as great bodily injury. And so that actually sort of transforms the case from one of a non-violent felony to a violent felony. So that's one of the tools that I have as a prosecutor in charging a case, elevating the seriousness of the charges, so that way a judge has all the information that they need to hold this person accountable in the right way. Now, I talked about attempted murder earlier, and that, in my view, goes hand in hand with criminal threats. And as you heard at the beginning when we were talking about medical testimony, oftentimes there is a threat to kill or an express threat of physical violence during a strangulation incident. I'm going to kill you. I want you to, you can imagine them for yourselves. But those threats are separately chargeable, and they also are direct evidence of an intent to kill that I would need in order to prove up an attempted murder case. Now, I've just thrown a lot at you, and I just did, consistent with the fact that I did my lawyering bit. So of course, as soon as we start talking about like specific penal code sections, I could talk all day. But at the beginning, when I talked about laws, I also talked about evidence code section 1109, meaning my ability to bring in a domestic violence history or evidence of serial domestic abuse in my case. And one of the most important charges that I have is Penal Code Section 273.6, which is evidence that the defendant committed this offense and in doing so violated a domestic violence restraining order. Because that evidence allows me to bring in not only the fact that, hey, this person had a restraining order at the time, but also to bring in either a separate victim who may have gotten a restraining order, and to bring in the reasons why that person got a domestic violence restraining order. In strangulation cases, one of the most important tools that I have is evidence of habit or pattern, or what we sometimes call MO, modus operandi, the way someone does things. And the legislature recognizes that domestic violence cases are, although they are tragically common, they are rare in life. Most people make it through their entire lives without being accused of physically assaulting someone. Most people make it through their lives without someone who they've been in a relationship with describing that the assailant has put their hands on the victim's neck. And yet, I'm allowed to bring in evidence that, you know, not only has this woman who's coming in, not only has this victim described this pattern of strangulation in their own life, but what are the odds that 4 years before, somebody else also sought a restraining order, and in their restraining order application mentioned the suspect or the defendant putting their hands on the victim's neck and strangling them to unconsciousness. So restraining order history is a huge sort of factor of what I do, and it's a huge facet of my work because it actually allows me to bring these cases and to get juries on board with understanding the severity of the conduct and recognizing serial domestic abuse for what it is. I think we had, I believe it was Miss Elliott asked earlier about how it is that we as criminal justice partners, how are we able to work with members of the community who maybe come from a different background or have a skeptical view of law enforcement. And one of the things that I always point people towards are restraining order applications, because those applications are vital as part of victim safety plans, but also for somebody who continues to engage in serial domestic abuse, that becomes vital evidence for my office and for someone doing my job later on. So I've given you kind of a broad overview for everyone of kind of the way that I do my job and how my job functions. I'd like to turn it over with a little bit of time that we have for questions. So I realize I've thrown a lot at everyone. So please turn it to me if I said anything that you're going, I'm sorry, throw up a hand. I'm happy to listen.
I didn't hear you say what DVRO was. Can you tell me again?
Oh, I'm so sorry. Domestic violence restraining order. I used some that was inside baseball talk. I apologize. So domestic violence restraining order is a specific kind of restraining order that is issued by judges in domestic violence cases. That can come either in a family law case or in an order or restraining order asked for in family court or as part of a criminal case. Does that answer your question?
Adam, there was also a question. I know that I see someone else having their hand up, but there's a question about children being brought into the courtroom to testify. Can you talk a little bit about that?
And I'm sorry, let me see if I can pull up.
Adam, if you want to stop sharing, you'll be able to see everybody.
I think I can. Hold on. All right. Yeah. So, and I'm seeing a question from Susan Jamerson that says, are children brought into the courtroom to testify that they saw their mom being strangled? It sounds like that would be too traumatizing for the kids. So I'll say that I have put children on the stand to describe if they were witnesses to a strangulation. That is absolutely something that I've had to do in the course of my career. Is it traumatizing? I think that at the end of the day, the reality is that I'm talking to somebody who witnessed very likely near lethal levels of force against somebody that they love. My goal when I meet a child, if I have to call that person to testify, is to ensure that I can take all the trauma out of it that I can. So one of the things that our office does is we make sure that when we work with victims of violence, we have victim advocates who are assigned to the case. We also do numerous court tours. And so in the times that I've had to put children on the stand where they were witnesses to domestic violence, one of the tools that I use is I meet up with the victim, I meet up with the victim's family, and we take a tour together apart from the day when they're being asked to testify. We go into a court, an empty courtroom, and I just ask them questions about their life. Things that don't have anything to do with anything, things about, you know, what they like to do with their free time, what they think about school. Because when victims come into court, if they haven't been in a courtroom before, being in a new space is itself stressful and scary. What I can do to take the tension or take the air out of that by putting somebody in a familiar environment and getting them comfortable with the way that a lawyer sounds when they ask questions, in my view, that goes a long way towards making victims comfortable. So there are times when children are witnesses to crimes. It is a tragedy, but I can imagine this scenario in which I said, well, I don't want to traumatize a child. And so I'm going to have this woman testify, or this child's mother testify, but not bring in other victims or other witnesses who may have seen the crime. And I can't imagine the scenario of how I would feel if afterwards a jury said, well, yeah, but proof beyond a reasonable doubt, so we're saying not guilty. And that's a tough position to be in. So I think that the goal is to try and take the trauma out of the process of testifying as best we can. And part of that is also ensuring that after these crimes occur, our victim witness advocates make counseling available to victims and their families. So in my view, it's really important that kids get into counseling or into therapy as soon as possible, and that our office makes those resources available.
And if I could add to that, one other piece that we offer is any victim or survivor of a crime, whether it's the children witnessing an incident, whether it's the survivor, him or herself, you have the right to have an advocate present when you testify. So that doesn't mean that an advocate will sit at the galley of the courtroom. It could mean that person could sit right behind you and support you when you do testify. Another thing that we have at the district attorney's office, or the county rather, is what they have taken on as something that works really well is therapy dogs. So the sheriff's office has what they call therapy dogs, where these dogs are trained to just be lazy. They just sit there, or lay there rather, and lay at your feet and are there to support you, whether it be when you're being interviewed, whether it be you're testifying, whatever the case may be, the pup is there. And so if you have somebody who is a pet friendly or a pet lover, that tends to work out really, really well.
And I to speak to that a little bit, the dog that we use is named Bear. And, you know, there's a story that I always tell to families when I talk about the prospect of the child having to testify. And I was in a meeting once with kind of the higher ups in my office, as well as a few police chiefs. And I was asked to speak. And so there was a point when the elected DA looked at me and said, and Adam, where are we at with, you know, whatever the issue was? And at the time, Bear was in the corner of the conference room where we were having this meeting. And Bear hadn't moved a muscle for probably 40 minutes at this point. And I started talking, and I was really nervous because I was talking to this, you know, it was a high consequence kind of meeting. And I was really scared. For the first time in that whole meeting, Bear got up Bear walked across the room and Bear sat down on my feet. Nobody had to say anything to Bear to get Bear to do that. That's what the dog is trained to do. Bear recognized that I was the person who needed help. You know, so I always say that to kids because, you know, it's a pretty special thing that we have that resource available. And that goes a long way with kids, is just having a dog snore on your feet. I look forward to it at the end of every day. And, you know, I'm glad that we have that I don't know, we treat people like human beings in that way.
We have one more question from Swastika. Swastika, do you want to ask your question? And then we're going to unfortunately have to move forward.
All right, sorry about that.
You're good, Adam.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really informative and helped me understand how strangulation goes a long way than just the blue marks. How does the cases of strangulation move forward if the victims have been the aggressor in previous incidents and has been reported to the police? How does that go? Does that impact the cases moving forward?
I want to make sure that I understand. Are you speaking about cases in which the victim has prior cases or sorry, has prior reported incidents of strangulation?
Has prior incidents where they have been the aggressor, not the victim.
Okay. So obviously I'll say, and this is my lawyer answer, I'm going to say it's it depends because it's going to be on a case by case basis. However, when I look at a victim of violence and somebody's reporting domestic violence in a case in which there is a record of them having been an aggressor in the past, the first thing that I'm trying to do is come at looking at that prior record with fresh eyes. Because what I want to assess is the evidence of that prior arrest actually evidence of that person acting in self-defense and maybe in a way that it wasn't appreciated at the time. In January of next year, I'm getting ready for a trial in which there is one prior report of domestic violence between the perpetrator and the victim. And that prior report is one in which the victim was arrested. My victim, in my case, was arrested. And she was arrested because the suspect in my case, the defendant, had a huge bite mark underneath his armpit. And I don't think it takes a lot of imagination to understand how that could have been inflicted. You know, it's very clear to me that that is a crime that occurred where, you know, officers back then, they looked at the set of facts that they had and they said, well, this person has an injury, this person doesn't. What was really going on? So I think that it's important that the new information that we have has to inform how we look at a prior case in which somebody was a victim, or sorry, in which somebody was a suspect. And I can't give you clearer analysis than that, but that's the best I can give you.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you.
And Adam, can you hit stop share at the top of your screen for me?
Absolutely, I can. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, appreciate it.
All right, we're going to go ahead and go forward. We're in our last stage of presentations, and this is going to be a co-presentation between myself and Ashley Palomino from Stand for Families Free of Violence. Give me 1 second. Let me get the slideshow going here. Okay, so this portion of the presentation, we've heard about the health and medical risks of being strangled. We've heard the ways in which victims are interviewed, evidence is collected, and how the DA goes about prosecuting strangulation crimes. What we really also wanted to focus on at the end of this great host of panelists was talking about the ways in which both advocates, domestic violence advocates within the county handle cases of strangulation, and also on a larger scale, what our county has done recently in creating a strangulation task force. So I'm going to go ahead and start this portion of the presentation. And the reason why this county created a task force in 2019 was because California actually passed a law that required any law enforcement officer responding to a domestic violence incident to give a statement that informs the victim that strangulation can cause severe injury and/or death, and that they need to seek medical attention. So for those of you that don't live in Contra Costa County or are not aware of the way our county law enforcement is made up, we have 26 law enforcement agencies. Each city has its own police department. So trying to get 26 law enforcement agencies to do something uniformly, like giving this new required statement, is really hard. And so what we did is we came up with the Strangulation Task Force. And the Strangulation Task Force is a collaborative effort between several different partners in our county: Family Justice Center, Stand Families Free of Violence, the District Attorney's Office, Kaiser Permanente, the county itself, Alliance to End Abuse, with Walnut Creek Police, Richmond Police, and Brentwood Police. And this group came together after that law was passed and specifically said, we need to create a uniform approach so that every single law enforcement agency, every advocacy agency, and even the medical community are aware of how to handle strangulation cases. And so what we did was we focused on training, and we focused on creating a little card for law enforcement officers to be able to carry in their pocket. So when they respond to domestic violence instances, they can pull this out, and then they have something they can actually read for the victim. So this is what we created. We created the strangulation assessment card, and it gives a little bit of a rundown of the things you should do if you have been strangled. You really should seek medical attention. Cost of medical care may be covered in the situation. And then on the bottom, it also has signs and symptoms for the victim to look for over the next several days. Because we heard Dr. Watson say some of these symptoms don't show up right away, right? And so we want the victim to be aware of things that might be changing and things that might be critical for medical professionals to know. And then the very middle of this assessment card, we have the statement that law enforcement is supposed to read out loud to the victim and then hand over the card. So I'm not going to read this all to you, but the one portion that I try and highlight for people is that research shows that if you are strangled even one time, you are 750% more likely to be killed by your partner. And we very intentionally put that language in this advisement to relay to the victim how severe strangulation is, because we so often see it minimized by the clients that we work with. On the back of the card, it's also really important because this is what you can give to a medical professional if after an instance of domestic violence, you need to go to the hospital. Let's be honest, the majority of us are not doctors. We have not studied medicine. So if somebody strangles me, I have no idea what steps need to happen at the hospital. But we've been able to take this from the Strangulation Training Institute. These are the things that we want hospitals to do if a victim comes in and hands over this card. Makes it really easy, makes them aware that a strangulation incident has occurred and this needs to be taken seriously. So one of the things the task force really was focused on was training medical professionals. So we've been very fortunate in that we've been able to train Kaiser Permanente, John Muir Health, Regional Medical Center. We're working on training Sutter Delta as well, so that if somebody comes into the emergency room or makes an appointment with their primary care physician and they have this card, everybody in the building already knows what this is. It doesn't have to be explained by the victim or survivor coming in, that it's already just set. We know you're a survivor of strangulation. These are the next steps that we're going to take. And so a lot of people often ask, well, how does a survivor get the card in the first place? What if they don't end up calling the police? At the Family Justice Center and at Stand, which Ash is going to talk about in a minute, we also give out those cards to clients. So sometimes, like we had discussed earlier, some people don't want to call police, and that's okay. You don't have to. But if you've been strangled, there is a high risk that there could be an issue medically that you may have that you don't even recognize you have. And so typically at the Family Justice Center, what we do is if a client comes in and they disclose to me or one of our navigators that they've been strangled, we try and get an idea of how long ago they were strangled. Was it yesterday? Was it 4 months ago? And we get this timeline because that's going to determine how critical the need is to go see a medical professional. And so if somebody tells me that at least within the last 2 weeks, they were strangled by their partner and maybe they were strangled where they blacked out, and now they're having, their voice sounds different, or they still have pain in their neck, I almost immediately stop the conversation and I say, I really strongly encourage you to get medical attention. And this is where you can go to get that medical attention. And I try and explain the reason why I'm kind of halting the rest of our interaction, because of the severity that, especially if you're still experiencing those symptoms, that means there might be something medically wrong. Now, I don't force people to go to a hospital. So if a client continually says, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that, I say, okay, I try and let them know my concerns as much as I can, but I'm going to respect their decision because it's their body, right? So the next thing that we try and do is we connect the client as soon as possible to a STAND liaison, a STAND advocate. And STAND is the Domestic Violence Crisis Center for the county. And I'm actually going to switch over to Ashley here. If you want to go ahead and take it away, Ashley.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Palomino. I'm the Crisis Line Emergency Response Services Manager. So you mentioned a little bit about the lethality assessment, Chris, but I'm going to go into a little bit more details about this program. So this is an evidence-based protocol. This is devised by Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence and STAND and Richmond and a couple other law enforcement jurisdictions. We're able to partner with Yale to kind of implement this and hopefully reduce the homicide rate by about 50%. So that's the intention with this lethality assessment program. It again is to determine who is at the highest risk of being killed by their partner based on this screening. It is based on the Jackie Campbell danger assessment that some of you guys may be familiar with as well, or at least heard about, that took some of those risk factors, compared it with DV homicides that had occurred. And these are the questions that were present in most, if not all, of the cases. The biggest question again is just the victim, whether or not the victim feels like they were going to be killed. One of the questions though on here is about being choked. Now, the language on this screening is specific so that the victims or survivors hear that and understand and also reciprocate that language, right? So again, the technical term is strangulation, but every client I have ever worked with has always said choked. Right. So we're trying to mimic their language so that way they answer a yes versus no, I wasn't strangled. Oh, but he did put his hands around my throat, right? In some conversations that we've had. So language is super key. And so this helps shift how we were capturing this information. It also helped shift the information that advocates needed, because we realized we were not able to really explain what happens or what could happen to you after you were strangled. So part of, again, the Strangulation Institute was training not just law enforcement, not just the medical professionals, but also the advocates as well, in terms of how do we have these conversations with victims, especially as we are initiating these screenings. So as again, we know that not all victims want to reach out to law enforcement. We completely understand. We can absolutely talk to them about our partnerships and kind of hopefully help with some of those fears of being deported or fears about working with law enforcement, because again, we have these great partnerships. But if they don't want to, that's fine. They still do get these lethality assessment screenings through us, through the crisis line, whether or not they want to be anonymous or whether or not they want to come into services. Those are conversations. But when they do answer yes to being choked or strangled, and they do kind of talk about this, and again, maybe they're focused mostly on the emotional, the name calling, but then they mention briefly in the conversation about having, you know, their hands, the person's hands around their throat, and they don't really remember much else. That's also when we stop and pause and like, oh, hold on, let's go back to that, because that's a huge concern. We also tell them that they are at risk of being killed, not only by screening in through this, but also with strangulation. And the dangers of it. So we are really, I think you can go to the next slide, Natalie, and we really have shifted our health advocacy around that and been able to describe to them a little bit more in detail about why we're so afraid for them, because they can die at any point in time due to stroke after the incident. Maybe they don't have any symptoms, right? At least not yet. Maybe they don't have any bruising. That does not mean that they're not at risk of dying after the incident. And so we really encourage them to try and, again, seek medical attention. And if we are seeing them in person, right, we can give them these cards to have that information lingo to go to the hospital, etc. Oftentimes what we see is the clients want to get into some sort of service or support or get into the shelter or something first before they're able to kind of stop, pause, and then focus on their physical health and well-being. And so we do, again, we don't force them to go into services. We absolutely work with them. Even if that is wanting to return home, how can they do that safely and remain in the relationship safely? What are those safety plans in place? But really, again, allowing them the opportunity to understand the seriousness of having that hand around their throat and how, yes, you can absolutely breathe and you are still at risk of dying. Because again, it does not take much pressure for there to be serious complications. So once they answer those questions or once we have those conversations, again, we really pivot, just like Natalie was mentioning, and really go towards lean into the health education piece of it. Around the strangulation and also safety planning and what other supports they may need. In addition to that, we also, maybe refer the clients to our MDT. So many of the folks that are part of the strangulation task force is also part of high-risk MDTs, multidisciplinary team meetings, to really wrap around services and try and work with these survivors who are, again, at the highest risk of being killed by their partner. To see how we can support the victim and also hold accountability for the person who is causing the harm. And again, the major portion of the lethality prevention piece is really entry into services within 72 hours from the incident. So again, if they are working with the police, and Richmond has responded, they've done their lap screen and called in the high risk screening. Not only are they hearing from Richmond Police Department, for example, that they are at risk of being killed, they're also hearing by the victim who's on the hotline, speaking with them directly, and then hoping to get them either into shelter or support group or restraining order, however we can get them safe, because that is the key portion of homicide reduction with this lethality assessment protocol.
All right, thank you, Ashley. That was all we had. We're doing really good on time. So I wanted to take a minute to share both Ashley's email and my email as well, if you have other questions about, how we came up with the way in which, we are two very different agencies. We partner very closely together, but our response to strangulation is exactly the same. And all the law enforcement officers are aware of the response that we give to clients, and we're aware of what they give to clients as well. And I think it's really important to recognize that uniform approach, because that's what's going to help save lives, to be completely honest. So let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. I saw a question in the chat from Jessica. Hi, Jessica. If we could have, so Jessica works for Bay Area Legal Aid. She could get a stack of the cards for clients. Yes, if you work for an organization that would like to have those strangulation assessment cards available to you, I have a soft copy of them that I'm happy to send to you. And then we also still have some printed that I can mail. So if you're an organization within Contra Costa County that would like to have those, please feel free to reach out to me at my email. What other questions do people have for either Ashley or myself?
I saw that there was one question about the percentage of strangulation. So I will say that because we have the lab, we do have some data. Unfortunately, I can't release that data due to it being part of a study, but it was pretty significant in terms of how many in just the 3 jurisdictions we were doing and reviewing. The percentage of victims that were answering yes, that question was staggering, is what I can say.
And yes, to answer the Latina Center asked, do you have it in Spanish? Yes, we do. So they've been translating it into English and Spanish. We want to make sure that it's accessible to as many people as possible. Other questions people have about any of the topics we covered today? I know it was a lot, but I really appreciate your time in being here and listening to these, because it's more information we have about it, the better we can help the clients that we work with. Sylvia, yes.
What's the percentage of strangulation in Contra Costa County?
Oh, so Ashley just answered that. Unfortunately, we're part of a study and we're not allowed to release the information. We can say it was high.
Okay, I just want to get an idea
Mhm.
for awareness purposes, you know? I mean,
Yeah.
I could ask nationwide, but you know,
Yeah.
it's too broad for me because I'm not gonna go around the nation.
Yeah.
But just to,
What I will also say is all 26 law enforcement agencies within Contra Costa County every year have to report the number of strangulations that are reported to them. So that's definitely not all of the strangulations that happen within Contra Costa County. There's significantly more because lots of people do not call the police. But the police, starting in 2018 with that bill that I was just discussing about how they have to give the verbal statement now, they now have to categorize how many of the responses they do to domestic violence instances, how many of those were strangulation. So the DOJ has that information as well. And I can't grab the website right here because I got to look through my emails, but when we send out the PowerPoint, I'll have that included in the language of the email so you can get an idea.
thank you much.
What I can say is, you know, again, based on the research and the numbers that I have seen, is it's a lot more common than you think, especially when you're using the word choke versus strangulation. And depending on the space that you're in, right? If they're talking to law enforcement, they may not report it unless they're doing the lethality assessment. But to advocates, they report it a lot more frequently. And it's definitely something that happens a lot more than what you would anticipate or imagine.
And unfortunately, I know the DOJ data, Department of Justice data, does not break it down by race, gender, age. Did they respond to a DV instance? If so, was there strangulation involved? Those are what they're required to report on. Any other questions? All right, well, I want to sincerely thank all of our presenters, Carrie Watson, who's not here anymore, but Adam Wilkes from the DA's office, Sergeant Tong, Ashley Palomino. We really appreciate your time. And like I said, we'll be sending out the PowerPoint as well as an evaluation. We genuinely read the evaluations on if we've done well or if we haven't done well. That's almost more important because we want to fix the future trainings. So please it'll only take you about 2 minutes to fill out. But thank you all for being here, and we'll hopefully see you at another training of the Family Justice Institute.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.